Hey everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. No angry car rant David this week, but I did have a lot of fun doing that, so you can probably expect to see me doing that again in the future at some point. But for this week's video, I will be normal, generally positive David. Anyway, update for the podcast. We just dropped our first of two episodes about Vladimir Lenin and the Russian Revolution, so if you haven't heard that, give it a listen. It's on every, podcast platform as usual. Our second one should be coming out soon. Our editor works really hard for us. She just also has a really demanding day job. So, the fact she's even helping us out is super cool. So be on the lookout for part 2 to be coming out hopefully in the next week and a half, 2 weeks. We'll also soon be recording an episode about heavyweight boxing champions. And not just about their individual careers, although we'll be talking about that too, but also kind of what makes them like historically and sociologically interesting. Obvious example, Muhammad Ali, the way he was associated with the Black Power movement and resisted the draft to Vietnam. That's the sort of thing we'll be talking about. Not that specific era for all these champions or even that same ideology, but just the fact that, you have these champions that are connected to bigger historical forces beyond just the sport that they're in. And, the heavyweight champions that we'll be covering are from an era, or really series of eras, when the heavyweight boxing champion was like the number one figure in sports. And so they carried a lot of cultural weight. And so when they got involved in big issues of the day, it's pretty interesting, I think. And we hope y'all will think that too. But anyway, getting to this week's video. So this week's video is about generations, the concept of generations and their relation to history. But before we get too much into the weeds, I'm going to start with something that might sound, kind of basic, but is a good jumping off point to get into more sort of interesting ideas. So to start off, really important to understand that the idea of generations is completely arbitrary. It is completely made up. There's no real set beginning or end point for any generation. And you even see that in trying to define the year ranges of different generations. Like if you look up when are millennials born year-wise, or, Gen Xers or whoever, you don't really find a unanimous range because it's completely arbitrary. I mean, you could say like the beginning of the baby boomers after everyone comes home from World War II. Like that makes sense. 1945 is the start for the baby boomers. But beyond that, the cutoff dates are pretty arbitrary. And so say the cutoff for millennials to Gen Z is 2005. A millennial born in 2005 has way more in common with a Gen Zer who's born in 2006 than they do with a millennial who was born in, like the late 80s or something. So, again, arbitrary, but I still think that the concept of generations is useful as long as you kind of don't take it as a gospel. And I think there are kind of two ways to look at generations. So I'm going to start with the way that I think is way less useful and way less interesting, to sort of push back against it before getting into what I think is a more useful way to look at generations. There's this tendency among older people, and younger people as well, especially the younger people that just kind of have that, like, get off my lawn energy, even though they're, like, 22. But there's this tendency among some people to think that basically every generation is like a reset button for society, and that each new generation kind of comes into this blank slate of a world and kind of, arbitrarily chooses whether to be good or bad or have this or that interest or whatever. And I don't think that's a really insightful way to look at it, because it ignores everything about the world around them to only focus on their individual decisions, as if at like 5 years old, young people like have a meeting and decide whether or not they're going to like respect authority or be obsessed with smartphones or something. Like, it clearly doesn't work that way. So I think it's a lot more interesting and a lot more useful to look at the world that each generation grows up in. I think that's really the most useful thing about thinking about history in terms of generations, because the world that a millennial or a Gen Zer comes into is very different than the world of a boomer, and the world of a boomer is very different than someone who was born in the late 1800s or something. And the obvious example I'll go into, probably something that most of you listening can relate to, is the world of millennials in relation to the economy, right? So, millennials, we came of age sort of near adulthood, but again, it depends on specifically the year you were born. But we generally came into adulthood around the time of the Great Recession, right? On top of that, going back a little bit before that, most of us remember 9/11. And those two things kind of shattered the myth, right, of this invincible America in different ways. 9/11, of course, kind of taught us that, before this catastrophe, the U.S. was the lone global power. Everything was safe, end of history. If you've heard of that concept before. If not, check out my first video of Mouthful, David. I actually talked about that. But basically, it was this idea that after the end of the Cold War, we'd reach the end of history, and it was just a matter of liberal capitalism and democracy kind of spreading over the world, because communism, our major foe, had been defeated, and so everything would be fine and good, right? Obviously, 9/11 shatters that. The Great Recession shatters that in a different way, especially because we never really fully recovered. I mean, the job market never fully recovered. The markers that we use, like GDP and stuff like that, recovered, but a lot of those big economic indicators don't relate to people's everyday lives. And I mean, I could make a whole video about that, so I'll just kind of, leave that there. But basically, that was the world we came of age in. And then now, most of us are around 30. I actually just literally turned 30 this year. And we are in this pandemic. We are in an economic collapse, basically. And, of course, we have everything going on in terms of the movement for Black lives, against police brutality, and a number of other things, right? And so this world is very different than, someone who was born maybe 20 years before us is encountering, someone for whom the post-World War II prosperity of the United States was something that they actually got to enjoy, and something that wasn't interrupted so violently. And then to kind of go in the other direction, you have Zoomers who've basically not come of age in a world defined by 9/11 and the Great Recession, but grew up. Some of them born after 9/11 grew up in that world, and it's normalized to them in a way where even myself, someone who was born in 1990, grew up during the 90s, and had a little bit more of that pseudo sense of security. I mean, for personal reasons, I didn't have the most secure stable childhood, but that's more of a personal thing and rather a big picture thing. But anyway, all of this is to say that generations are an interesting tool to analyze history with if you use it to look at how people come into a world that's different than the generations before, and how they respond to it, which, for millennials and especially for Gen Z, has yet to be written completely. We as in millennials are adults, but we're not like middle-aged yet. We haven't our story, I guess you could say, remains to be written, and obviously Gen Zers are at the beginning of those stories. So here's hoping to us making good decisions. Here's to us having each other's backs, and I hope the histories that we can write decades from now are positive ones. It's hard to say. It's hard to know what's going to happen. There's a lot of shitty things happening right now, obviously. But, you know, you can't predict the future, but you can just try to look at the world around you and understand it. So anyways, that's my video this week, everyone. Thanks for listening. Stay safe out there, and catch you next week.